Welcome everybody, Shiur number 618. We're learning today Le'iloi Nishmas Moshe Dov ben Rabban Zisel Le'iloi Nishmas Belima Bas Rab Moshe. Okay, getting back to our malacha of kosher tying. So the last shiur we explained the difference between kosher tying and toifer sewing. Just real quickly, we said that kosher means to tie two items together, but they still remained separately. In other words, they still continue to hold on to their identity. I have two items tied together, very nice, but I see one is here, one is there, and they are still separated. They're just tied together. Whereas toifer sewing, you take basically two items, two pieces of material, and making it into one by either, we mentioned, sewing with the needle and thread, or gluing, or the like, which we're going to discuss in the malacha of toifer. Okay, but the bottom line is, by toifer sewing, you bring two pieces of material, making it into the one, and kosher is two items which stay separate, just tied together. Now, the question is, with kosher tying, where was it done in the Mishkan? We always try and go back to where it was done in the Mishkan and to, how it became one of the Lamites Malachas. So explains to us the Sefer Lamites Malachas on page 783 in the introduction of kosher tying. So he says like this: in the Mishkan, the knots were necessary for making nets. In other words, when one makes a net to trap an animal, it's full of knots. It's the way it's done. But there's knots, there's four corners, there's squares, however, but you have a whole bunch of knots in a net. So the knots were necessary for making nets used to trap what we know as the chalazain, a rare type of fish, which is special. It was a special blue dye that was used for the techeles. The dye was required for the urias, for the coverings, for the curtains of the Mishkan, and so on. Now, he brings out another, according to the Yerushalmi, there was another way of making knots, nothing to do with nets. We're not going to get into the whole thing to do with the loom, but in any case, it's a little bit complicated to go through the whole thing. So there was another way of making knots. But Lamaisa, he goes through, does the Sefer Lamites Malachas, continuing to explain that to prepare thread for stitching, as we know, those of us who sew, that to prepare thread for stitching, it's necessary to tie the ends of the thread into a knot after the threading is through the eye of the needle in order to tighten and hold the stitching in the seam. Now, as we know, we have the malacha of toifer sewing, which we are learning on our alternate days, and that has to do with a needle and thread, which in the same thing, by the same token, the thread had to be tied, a knot had to be tied on the top in order to go through the eye of the needle, as we know in the regular sewing. Similarly, the ends of the stitches in a seam must be tied into knots to keep the stitching from unraveling. So Lamaisa, these were all. So Lamaisa ends off that tying these knots is the malacha of kosher, and these were various different ways how it was used in the Mishkan. So now we still have it today. Obviously, if you tie one who ties a knot at the end of a string, somebody who does tailoring, they do it the same way. And as we go down the line, we're going to see how these come into play in reference to halacha, the various types of knots as we explain them. Now, he brings on further, does the Sefer Lamites Malachas, actually it's from the Mishabur who brings it down, B'Shem the Rambam, and so on, that Lamaisa, the act of tying itself, is not only as we know it today as a knot, which we're going to talk about. There's a couple of types of knots that could be made, and that was used, in our history, and that's how we got the halachas, we developed the halachas in kosher, the various different types of halachas. But Lamaisa, besides the actual knot per se as we know it, he brings down Lamaisa like this: kosher is the binding of two separate pliant objects, usually string or rope, by twisting one around the other in a skilled or permanent manner. And we're going to talk about the various the kesher shel uman and kesher shel kayama. We're going to see how that comes into play. Rope or string is ordinarily bound together by tying two lengths to each other, the two ends to each other, or to themselves, with some type of knot. However, okay, so that's the regular type of knot that we know. However, the malacha of kosher of tying does not does not necessarily, the malacha of kosher, of tying, does not necessarily have to take the form of the conventional knot as we know it today. Any manner by which two pliable items are firmly intertwined is kosher, because again, let's keep in mind that the item is attaching, the point is attaching two items and, making them intertwined to make them, by toifer, it's making them into one. But by tying, they're still recognizable, each item separately, but they're being twined, they're intertwined together, like a regular knot, but also intertwining two ropes together. So the example he brings down, twining two or more cords to form a thick rope is also kosher, because twining the different cords effectively binds them together. Lamaisa, that they're being bound together, it's even sometimes, if you could think about it, stronger than a regular knot. A regular knot, you still see, whatever, it's a knot, and you still see the separate. Over here, you have, it's mamish becoming into one. So now twining two cords to form a thick rope, it's sort of like a topher, like a sewing type thing, whereby it becomes one, but still it's recognizable. The two ropes are recognizable, but they're intertwined, they're twined together, these two ropes, and they bind together, and they're mamish bond together, just like a regular knot. And in conjunction with that, the Rambam Taka brings down, Mishabur brings it down like that, Lamaisa, that twining two ropes together, forming them into one rope, is the malacha also of kosher. And we're going to see how that comes into play in reference to the possibly twist ties in certain times, certain ways, whatever. We'll see, because again, twist ties, if you think about it, this twine is being twined together. But again, it's a discussion which we have to talk about, but we're going to see how this actually comes into play in halacha lamaisa in certain instances, as far as regular twining of rope, as opposed to actually making a knot. Okay, so now we have the understanding as to what a knot is all about. We want to get into there are basically two types of knots, which are brought down, the Gemara brought down, the Shulchan Aruch, and so on. And we use them both in various different halachas. So I want to start to explain a little bit, and next year, Bezras Hashem, in Kosher, we'll go a little bit more into detail and see how they play in the practical applications. So he explains further, does the Sefer Lamentes Malachas, that Lamaisa, almost any type of knot falls within the general premise of Kosher, either under a malacha mediaraisa of kosher or a drabanan of kosher. So, but lamaisa, to make a long story short, there are two principal categories of the prohibited knots mentioned in the poskim, like we said. Okay, so the first type of knot that's mentioned is called a kesher uman. Kesher uman is simply a craftsman's knot. It's a more of a professional type of a knot. We'll try and get into some examples and see how they work, Bezras Hashem, the next year. But first, I just want to establish the two categories. So you have kesher uman, which is a craftsman's knot, a more professional type of a knot. Okay. The second type of knot which we're going to be dealing with, is called kesher shel kayama. A kesher shel kayama is what we know as a permanent knot, a long-term knot. Permanent knot doesn't actually always have to mean, permanent is going to stay forever and it's never going to open bichlal. It's some who hold like that, Taka. But lemaisa, we're going to see permanent knot. It's machloikis. We're going to talk about as to how long we're talking about. Is it 7 days? Is it 24 hours? But lemaisa, those are the two. So Lamaisa, we establish now the two types of knots. Again, you have the kesher uman, it's a professional type of knot. We're going to see how that works in halacha. And the second type of knot is a kesher shel kayama, a permanent type of a knot. It's not necessarily a fancy, uman type of knot, not a craftsman's type of a knot, but it's a more permanent knot that's going to last for a longer period of time. Okay, we're going to get more into detail, Bezras Hashem, in the upcoming Shiur, and see the practical applications, and see when we could work with each one. If you need to have both, if you have to have both the kesher uman and the kesher shel kayama to have a problem, or could it just be kesher uman, or could it just be kesher shel kayama? We're going to see how that works, and we're also going to see actually how this comes into play in reference to teifer when we start talking about the sewing part, that the kesher shel kayama is a permanence that comes into teifer, playing into teifer, and they're actually intertwined. It sounds funny, teifer, we talk about sewing into, making two pieces into one, and kosher tying two things together, but they're really intertwined. It's very very interesting. As we go down the line, we're going to see how Teifer sewing and KOSHAIR tying are really some of the the main foundations of to what makes it usher to do on Shabbos. We're going to see apply to both KOSHAIR tying and Teifer sewing. Okay, thank you for listening. Atzlacha and bracha kol tov.